Well, hello, welcome. And another Tuesday evening, another live show. We'll go in pre-show mode just for a moment or two. Hope everybody's well. And thanks very much for stepping up and coming on the show tonight. Lovely to see some new names as well as the old faithfuls. A very interesting conversation this evening. Very important data and, of course, quite a lot of uncertainty globally, which we'll touch on the way through. Just before I go into the main show, we'll just visit the dogs briefly. Oh, well, one dog. Meteor's around the corner at the moment, but Luna's sound asleep, having had lunch and also walkies as well. And for those who are interested, this is the setup, of course. I don't have a guest tonight. It's just me, but we've got quite a lot of gear here ready to go. And we've got the chat running. We've got the multi-view and everything else. So it's all, I think, functioning appropriately, which is always good to see. I did do a major rebuild this week. You may recall a couple of weeks ago, I had some issues with Tony Locantro on the live stream, and that got me into a rebuild mode. So I'm using a slightly different setup. You won't see much different if it works, but if it doesn't work, then you'll know that I've got more work to do. But it's a continuous improvement story with regard to the studio here. At least I think it's all working as far as I can tell. The audio's reporting okay. And hopefully you can hear me and see me okay. Anyway, I think we're at the top of the hour, so I'm going to take the pre-show off. I'm going to run the start of show, and I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 17th of June, 2025. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on the show tonight. Thank you very much for coming and spending some time with me and the rest of the community as we look at some of the most important data from my modeling, particularly now with all of the global uncertainty. There's a lot to talk about and we'll get straight into it. I will just remind you, I don't provide specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. We do moderate the chat, so feel free to put your questions, comments, and suggestions in. But we do moderate, and please be careful about what you say. Respect everybody else in the community. That'd be great. I've also enabled Super Chat, and that means you can get your question to the top of the list, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate those who do help us with that. Makes a huge difference to enable us to continue to make the shows. And if you'd like to get your question into the queue, if you use @WalkTheWorld, that'll make sure that I see it and get it handled. So with the formalities out of the way, what are we going to talk about tonight? Well, it's simply this. There is a lot to talk about with regard to the financial stress story across Australia, especially now. And I have to say that some of the recent media reporting has been, well, to put it politely, misleading with regard to what's actually going on. So I want to try and talk about some of those issues and specifically try and work out what really is going on. And very importantly, where is financial stress lurking across the country? Now, of course, we've had a couple of rate cuts, and the expectation from some is that the rate cuts will continue. Well, maybe not so fast on that, depending on what's going to happen. So I'm going to do this in sort of three segments. The first segment is I'm going to talk about some of the broader news, thanks to Cookie Boy, who's been supplying me with some very nice clips that I want to go through. Then I'm going to look specifically at some of my analysis from the modeling, and particularly looking at the mortgage stress, rental stress, financial stress. Look at that in the context of the mapping. And then thirdly, if you'd like to go into specific postcodes, I've had one request already, we can look at the data down at the postcode level as well and do some comparative analysis postcode to postcode. So that's the plan for this evening. As always, I'll be watching the chat as we go through, but bear in mind that I'm actually running this myself. I won't necessarily pick up the comments immediately, and I've seen that there's a couple of questions come in with regard to postcodes. I'll look back at those earlier on. Slight problem is that if I have so many comments, the top ones disappear forever. So if for any reason your request doesn't make it when I get into that section of the show, just ask it again. I'm not ignoring you, but it's just mechanics that it's easier when I've got somebody else talking because I can sort of make a note, but it's difficult to do when I'm Well, I'm just running it all myself. Anyway, let's get going because there's a lot to talk about. This is the starting point, of course, the financial review, world markets on war alert. And that, of course, is the big news at the moment, the new news. And by the way, there's a poll. Be interested in your question as to what you think, whether the RBA will be more or less likely to cut rates as a result of what's happening with regard to the conflict in the Middle East, particularly. And we've got some comments there. 37% are saying makes no difference to what the RBA is going to do. This is quite interesting, but we'll report that later in the show as well. The next one is just the comments here. So the RBA suggesting the oil price might be a concern. Now, I find that quite interesting because, of course, if you look comparatively, and this is the oil price, this is the WTI at 71.20 at the moment. Just to be clear, 71.20 is not dramatically high, and we had it going up to 120 briefly back in 2022-23. But, are people overreacting to a small move in the oil price? Possibly so. It's difficult to be absolutely clear about it, but certainly a question in my mind about whether, in fact, there's too much going on with regard to it. But this is what Michael Reed wrote. Oil prices jumped to 73 US a barrel as markets brace for potential supply disruptions. Chalmers on Monday warned there could be consequences of the war between Iran and Israel. Higher oil prices do pose the inflation risk outlook, and they also pose a risk to global growth, he said. From global economy is a pretty dangerous place right now. Australia is well placed and well prepared to deal with all of its uncertainty and volatility, but we won't be immune from it, Chalmers said. And of course, the markets are pricing in a 4 in 5 chance the RBA will cut the cash rate to 3.6% when they next meet on July the 7th and 8th. And JP Morgan has been forecasting that oil prices could surge to US dollars 120 to 130 a barrel as a worst case scenario, especially if they close the Straits of Hormuz. So that's the sort of the first point of departure. The second point of departure is this. There was an interesting connection here. So as you know, I've been highlighting the risks about this unrealized tax question and superannuation. And there's an article here that makes the point that if we see markets diving significantly, as it's possible they will, then there is a question of what happens when the unrealized gains are actually charged for, but never actually materialize. And they're talking here about the fact that few Australians understand how the tax works. It's not a liability of the fund, but a member of the fund. In other words, if you've got more than $3 million in your superannuation and they introduce this unrealized gain, then you will be liable for it. And that could be taking it out of your super or from another source. So it's not the fund itself that's being hit with this. And it's very interesting that the article suggests that this is part of a wider agenda. All Australians should be fearful. I think that's exactly right. The bottom line is this is a very bad development for the tax system. I know that the government needs to find more taxes, but I don't think this unrealized gains route is a very, very good route. And, there's been a lot of shenanigans from people saying, it's only a very small proportion of people and rich people making a fuss. But no. There are points of principle here, which I think are really, really important. And that's why I think this is something that should be resisted. And I'll continue to cover it on the way through. My earlier post on it, by the way, is doing very well even now. Now, here's another little snippet of information, which is quite interesting. And again, it just sets an interesting context. Here we've got the Housing Future Fund, the HAF. That was the one that was established in November 2023 to build 40,000 social and affordable rental homes by 2028. The major retirement fund investor backing Labour's flagship scheme to boost the supply of low-cost housing has barely handed out any money of the 10 billion programme more than 2 years after committing to do so. So the question is why? Well, partly, of course, is the concern about the longevity of the fund. And, of course, there's a question also about what the money is going to do and will it really make a lot of difference. But if you want to talk about money making a difference, here is the other side of the coin. This, of course, is the build-to-rent scandal. And now with the 15% tax support for it, etc., we're starting to see these types being announced. This is bad. This is bad policy. This is madness. What it means is that we're going to be building houses specifically for rent. International investors are coming to Australia and getting tax breaks, and I don't believe that that's a very strategic move. And it's interesting, in this article, they make the point that the original intent seems to be that developers were focusing on premium rental markets, although some of the others are now saying, oh, we might come down the market a bit. This is not going to help with affordable housing. And that's a very, very bad policy. And again, it's part of the problem of the housing system that we've got. Another interesting problem, and this was an article that showed that 1 in 6 young people have enough cash saved to buy a property under the federal government's 5% deposit scheme, which of course comes into effect in force on January. Typical $6,000-7,000 in savings, according to Westpac research. But the question here is, and this is the heart of the article, if people are stretching to get a deposit, but do they have enough cash flow to be able to service the mortgage, because the serviceability test is still there? And I think that's a very important point, particularly now with the cost of living being so high. And it takes us very much back to my analysis and my modeling. Serviceability, in other words, money in, money out, is the way to think about it. And it is an interesting quote here. It's alarming to consider the number of people who are just one step away from ending up in financial hardship. And unfortunately, a national debt helpline spokesman said, new demographics is experiencing financial hardship for the first time as cost of living pressures mount. Housing payments are the first cost to be met at the expense of other needs. Again, this is why when I focus on my analysis, I look not just at the mortgage or rental issue, I look at the total holistic cash flows. And that actually makes a very important and distinctive way of thinking about it, which I think is really important, particularly now. So that's why this is an important conversation. On the next slide here, this is an earlier show that I made, which was posing the question, is the financial stress worm finally turning, or is it eating its young? And you guess what? I actually suggested that there is some slight alleviation of stress. We'll come on to that in a second. But unfortunately, young people are being sucked in and spat out. And that's a real problem. Oh, and by the way, if you want to go into some of this in a bit more detail, I was part of a show on the Elephant in the Room podcast with Veronica Morgan and Chris Bates. It's just come out. And I'm talking specifically here about the massive amount of equity sitting in property and who has it and what the implications are. Did a bit of a show on this some time ago, but check out that show. It's available now. And incidentally, Veronica Morgan is coming up on my show next week, because Veronica and I are going to talk specifically about the buyer's agents, because there are some scandals that are emerging, and I've had some experience in the last 2 or 3 weeks through one-to-one conversations of people being scammed by buyer's agents. So I think it's good to have a conversation with Veronica, and that's what we're going to do next week. So mark your diary on that one. Now, when it comes to the trajectory of rates, of course, everyone's been saying, no, the RBA is definitely going to cut rates, etc. Even Warren Hogan acknowledged that there's a chance. But I do come back to this problem: the house price versus capacity to pay. This is a killer chart, of course. This is from CoreLogic and using RBA data, showing the median house price continues to spiral away. Capacity to pay isn't following, and that is the long-term structural problem we've had since the year 2000, thanks to a whole bunch of bad policies, thanks to the tax breaks for investment property, thanks to the loosening of lending standards and a whole bunch of other things too. And so this is where we are. And of course, again, you can see this in some of the real costs of city houses revealed. You need a massive amount of money just to buy in. And yet on the other side of the equation, if you look at the energy story, and if you look at the other costs of living, energy bills, internet and phone bills, insurance premiums rising, that's both car and home insurance as well. This is a recent article, of course, and it shows that for many people, they have a continued set of financial pressures. And again, I want to underscore, not equally spread across everywhere, but it's very, very resident amongst a lot of people. And interestingly, of course, they're now talking about wholesale gas prices who have tripled, but more prices rises ahead, particularly in New South Wales. New South Wales family, of course, looking for more bill shock just at the time when the government support for electricity is being moved away. And as a result of all this, I think there's a really important conversation to be had as to what's really going on with regard to housing and households. And there's a fascinating observation here that we're now seeing some people moving back into families again. So people who are out on their own can't afford to house themselves. So they're moving back. And just a couple of generations ago, 18, 19 or 20 marked the age of independence. Now it's 10 years plus later, which I think is pretty shocking. And in fact, now mid-30s quite often before people even consider. And interestingly, of course, more young people are now working multiple jobs to make ends meet. I see that in my surveys, and that's a big deal. And, the bottom line, of course, is it's now 2 full-time incomes rather than 1. The debt-to-income ratio is often 6, 7, 8, 9 times relative to 3 or 4 that it was 2 generations back. And like I say, it's now 2 full incomes. That means, of course, that people are more committed to paying more for childcare as a result of that, because they need to have their kids looked after during the day. Childcare costs are continuing to escalate significantly, and that's putting more pressure on more households. And wherever you look at this, the pressure is extremely concerning. And I just am amazed how some people seem to be just, dodging the issue and just saying, no, everything's fine. There's a huge story here of property prices are going to continue to rise. The banks will be able to lend more because interest rates are going to get cut. And we're going to build a lot more houses. And so magically, this is going to get solved. And as my recent show, The Migration Elephant in the Room is Missing in Action, another housing crisis report, showed so many people are talking this up without actually understanding migration is the critical issue. Migration is bringing a lot of people into Australia and putting huge demand on property. We're not building enough property, and that's putting more prices up, and no change. And the latest data that came up very recently continues to show that the momentum is extremely strong. And that is another part of the story. Now, as I made a show yesterday with Edwin and on the weekend, I came back to this article because this was showing the fact that they're claiming massive apartment skyrocketing prices in some areas. And, apartment price growth has matched or beaten houses in 2/3 of suburban markets. Now, I'm afraid that there's a huge scam going on here. This is not actually giving the full story. And again, look at that earlier show. But fascinating, of course, costs are rising. Home building costs are soaring. That's one reason why new properties in particular are continuing to rise. It's a massive and significant cost. And interestingly, of course, when you look at it, some of the properties that are actually coming on, particularly new properties, particularly units, are because the costs of apartments are significantly higher than they were. It's labour costs, it's materials costs. So all of those things are playing in. In fact, I made a show on this, and check it out if you want to look at that further. No choice but forced to buy units ahead of rate cuts. And by the way, just so we're clear, in real terms over the last 10 years, prices in real terms are up a quarter, 25% in aggregate. So when you talk about comparing prices a decade ago with now, just bear that in mind. And if we look at North Ryde, for example, the peak of North Ryde units were back in 2017 to 2018, more than $1 million. You can see that they dropped in 2019, and they've stayed, roughly in that band. There maybe 750s. And you can see here that there's been no growth for the last 2 or 3 years. Remember that this is before inflation, so just bear that in mind. Now, Mandurah, of course, over in Western Australia, a bit more of a story up, although went down first over 10 years. And you can see that the growth is quite variable. And if you look at Geelong, well, it's up and down like a yo-yo. peak in 2022. It's fallen in 2025, although there is a small rise towards zero now. So the point is that when you actually stop and think about this, what you realize is that all of the extra money that's been printed is devaluing the dollar. The value of the dollar means that the price ticket runs up, but it's not actually really helping anybody. And that equity, that 6 trillion of equity that's sitting in property, is actually a questionable amount when it comes to the amount that's going to be moved to the next generation. Total value of property, more than 11 trillion. 6 trillion is in this bucket, which is going to move in the next 20 years or so because of the demographic shifts and because people are going to fall off the perch. So there's a bunch of moving parts here, which I think it's worth thinking about. So with that context, and just to underscore, risk of rates not being cut, questions about affordability and about how households' budgets are working, and the pressure on households because of this pressure on price rises is all putting a significant pressure on many households. Now, when you look at the data from my surveys, and a quick reminder, this is the core market model. So we survey households and get information from other sources. The surveys run continually, and we can slice and dice the data lots of different ways, of course, to look at the information. And we can also form a view as to where things may move ahead with regard to the scenarios ahead. That's quite important given now. So we can take the data from the stress analysis, the price trajectory analysis, the buying and selling intentions, the migration, the broader economic data into the core market model through the scenarios. And that then gives us a view as to what might be happening ahead. Oh, and by the way, just a bit of an advert here. Make no apology for this, but we do provide a one-to-one service. If you want an individual conversation with me about a particular suburb, I can't give financial advice, but I can look at my data and talk about the underlying trends. I can look at home price data and the other information from our modeling. And this is typically an hour's conversation via Zoom or phone. And if you're interested, there is a cost involved because it's a lot of work to do it. I spend maybe half a day or a day researching it and talking to agents and things like that for a particular suburb. But there is a cost involved. But if you are interested, you can contact me via the blog. There are limited spaces. I'm booking 3 to 5 weeks ahead at the moment, simply because I've got so much interest. So that's just a little reminder. If you are interested in having a look at that, then look at the DFA blog and you can see there how to progress, or send me a message via the blog and I'll get back in touch. So let's now move on to the stress discussion, because of course mortgage stress is the heart of what we do. And there are, of course, many different definitions of stress, but I talk about cash flow. Cash flow is money in, money out. Now, these other definitions like 30% of income or taxable income or underwriting metrics. No, I look at it cash flow terms, money in, money out. And what it says, if you have more outgoings, excluding perhaps one-off discretionary items like going on holiday, for example, than income, we define them as stress. If they've got a mortgage, they're mortgage stress. If renting, they're in rental stress. Of course, investors can have cash flow pressures too, and we can identify those. And we can also aggregate the data at a postcode level to look at total financial stress. So that's a combination of mortgage stress, rental stress, and investor stress. And that gives us a bit of a read as to the total financial stress. And we can look at it in both percentage of households, which I think is probably a good, or indeed the count, which I think is better, because the law of big numbers suggests that the big counts are actually the most important to look at. Now, the RBA some time ago published this lovely little chart, which just shows that we go from budget pressures and mild stress through to missing payments and ultimately to insolvency. And that journey from mild to severe can take any time between 3 and 5 years. Now, I'm measuring stress at the mild end here, the budget pressure end. And not everybody, of course, ends up insolvent. The insolvency levels are still quite low at the moment. That's partly because the banks have been very flexible in trying to help people with, if they're in difficulty, and the hardship schemes. Although, interestingly, the ASIC report recently suggested those in hardship schemes don't necessarily really get long-term help. They just muddle through for a year and then have the same issue, only more so. The banks also often offer to go interest only or refinance, but that just puts more interest rate pressure on households later. So this is an important reminder that I'm talking here early, the mild end of budget pressures, when I talk about financial stress. And with that in mind, let's just look at the latest data. This is to the end of May. You can see that the rental stress has come back slightly to 74.2% of those in the rental sector. It was slightly higher previously, and that's a combination of some income increase. thanks to the low pay awards, some relief because of government handouts for electricity, and a few other factors. But on the other side, of course, rentals are still rising. And as I make a point often, whilst the advertised rents might be coming back slightly, a lot of people are actually having rent resets where they currently live and are choosing to just allow that to go through because the option of finding somewhere cheaper and to move is almost impossible. Look at mortgage stress. We're at 49.8, so just below the 50%. It's come back very slightly. Now, if you compare it with February 2020 at 32.9, it's still a lot higher. And you can see here that it's a lot of stress. It's up in record territory still. And just to give you the sort of the overview, by the way, I should add that the rental stress, mortgage stress on this chart is also added to by the debt to income ratio from the RBA that still shows it's pretty high. They keep resetting it because the ABS keeps resetting some of the data. So, but 181. Now, this is a deceptive number because it's not just households with a mortgage. And if you took households with a mortgage, the typical debt to income ratio is 5, 6, 7, or even 8 times now. So it's pretty high. Here is the data for April, and here is the data for May. And in May, you can see here that what I've done is highlighted where the numbers have gone higher. So in the ACT, Queensland, and Tasmania, mortgage stress is up. In rental stress, it was up in the ACT, Northern Territory, and Victoria. Investor stress was up in Victoria and Western Australia, and overall, and financial stress was up in the ACT, in Queensland, in Tasmania, in Victoria, but overall, financial stress was just down a little. And that's interesting observation, but look at the numbers. If we look at the financial stress number, 4.6 million households out of nearly 10 million households have financial pressures, so it's around half. If you look at the investor stress, it's not dramatic, only 17%, but that's 500,000 stressed investors in difficulty. If you look at rental stress, 74%, that's 1.8 million, that's 2.3 million rental stressed households. That's a large number of those in the rental sector. And if you look at mortgage stress at 49.8, that's 1.8 million households with cash flow pressures and a mortgage. So these are big numbers, very consequential numbers. And as I always do, I can also look at it in terms of our segments. And it's interesting to note that young growing families, first-time buyers, have the highest degree of mortgage stress. We have the highest level of stress for rental stress amongst the first-generation migrants, multicultural establishments, as I call them, 83.7%, which is well above pretty much all the others, although, of course, it's quite widely spread, as you can see there. If you look at investors, not surprisingly, the affluents, particularly the exclusive professionals and also the young affluents, have the highest pressures because they've got more leveraged property investments. And overall, financial stress is highest amongst the young growing families at 65.9%. And that's more than 484,000 households in financial stress. So that's worth thinking about. Now, in my earlier show, I went through each of those dimensions, listing out the top postcodes. Check that out if you want to go that route. But what I'm going to do now is to show you some of the other data that we have. It's important to understand, I think, that when I look at my data, I look at it in all sorts of different ways. One of the most interesting ways is to look at it through the mapping. And the mapping allows me to highlight some of the hotspots. So let me show you, for example, this particular chart, which is the map for mortgage stress. I'm going to start in the postcode 2000 and move out. And you can see here that the bluey is the low counts, and we go through the oranges and towards red, and the reds are the high counts. And as we pull out, you can see here that in and around the centre of Sydney, there are some areas where some people, are in some difficulty. Interestingly, places like Vaucluse and Randwick and Waterloo and Lane Cove and places like that, and Concord are registering some degree of stress. But, this is counts, so it's not dramatic. But as we go out, we can start to see that things do deteriorate. And it is the story, of course, of multiple problems in multiple places when you actually start looking at that. And you can see here, if we pull across, Liverpool stands out. Very significant pressure in and around Liverpool. If you go up further, you can see Blacktown is there as well. And then Camden and places like that, Campbelltown. So we have what I call the ring of fire as we sort of step back and look around. So east-west split, but there are pockets, nevertheless, around the harbour where there are some problems. Now, if I go to Melbourne and do a similar query, and again, we'll start in the centre of Melbourne, and you can see here that in the centre of Melbourne, there are a few issues. Not too bad, but it's not altogether flash. If you look at places like Hawthorn, Richmond, Footscray, West Footscray, places like that. And as we pull out and begin to see some of the other areas, we've got places over in the Wyndham area, Point Cook, we've got Taylor's Hill, and as we pull out further, we can see there that we've got down towards the Dandenongs with 3805, 3806, 3810. So again, around the centre, not too bad, but as you pull out into the suburbs, you can see this massive ring around Melbourne. And a lot of those areas around the eastern side of Melbourne is where a lot of the issues are. These are high growth corridors, a lot of relatively newly built property, a lot of people mortgaged up to the gills, and of course also having to pay a lot to travel to get into Melbourne. And those other costs are pretty important. So that's the story there. If we then go to Brisbane, Brisbane is not looking quite as bad, but with the significant rise in prices recently, I've noticed that the Brisbane mortgage stress and rental stress and financial stress is rising faster than in some other places. And you can see here that places like 4152 is already showing some signs of difficulty. And as we come out further towards Ipswich, Ipswich is a bit of a hot spot. You go up to 4034 north there, and you come down south as well. And you can see that, once again, there's different hot spots, different patches. It's a patchwork quilt, I should say, not kilt. That'd be quite interesting, wouldn't it? Gold Coast, of course, has some as well. And if we were to go north, we would see that further north too, there are also other pressures. And we'll just go to 6,000 and look at Western Australia, because, of course, Western Australia has experienced very strong price growth in recent times. And close in, there are some problems. But as you pull out, you can see there that Woodlands and Double View 6018 stands out as a little bit more of a problem. And in fact, as we pull out further north and south of the centre of Perth, you can see there that particularly on the coast, got places like Wanneroo, 6065, very much in vogue there, and further south to 6164, 6112. And as we pull out south, you can see that we've got to the north and to the south, particularly high levels of financial stress, particularly looking at mortgage stress at the moment. And that's because of the strong house price growth, the high migration into Western Australia, and the fact that many people are leveraged to the gills. So I will just open now another file, and I'm going to show the, get this sorted out. Okay. I'm going to do the same for rental stress. And again, I'm going to start in the middle of Sydney. And you can see here that in the middle of Sydney, there's more rental stress. Not surprising, really. A lot of people in and close to the city are struggling. And as we pull out, you can see there that places like Bondi and North Bondi, 2026, for example, Waterloo, has significant levels of rental stress. And as we pull out further, same issue, really. Parramatta's a bit of a hot spot. North, South Wentworthville as well, and Liverpool and Blacktown. So the rental stress is very interesting. It's more uniform than mortgage stress. And there are quite a few areas around the city where people are really struggling. A lot of those are actually units, and the rental stress in units is extremely high, especially in and around Sydney at the moment. If we then do a bit of a deep dive into Melbourne, you can see here that the centre of Victoria has significant amounts of stress. In fact, Victoria 3000 is one of the most stressed postcodes for rental stress. South Bank 3006 also pretty difficult too. As we pull out, you can see there those hotspots 3004 as well. And as we pull out, there are significant pressures across the postcodes. But again, it's interesting that over those 3029, 3030, Point Cook, places like that, in the Wyndham area, definitely feeling it. And Greater Dandenong also seeing some degrees there as well. So the story with rental stress is that it's a little more evenly spread relative to the mortgage stress, but there is significant pressure on many. And interestingly, that's one of the reasons why a lot of property investors are selling their investment properties in and around Melbourne at the moment, because with high rental stress, the returns are just not there. If I look at Brisbane, rental stress in Brisbane is also on the rise as well. Fortitude Valley, for example, Highgate Hill is showing significant pressure at the moment. And as we pull out, we can see other areas too also coming in. Quite a lot of areas now in the yellows, which if you compare a year or two ago, was less explicit in terms of rental stress. And Ipswich, of course, features again, I'm afraid, seems to be a very significant pressure area. 43002 down to the Gold Coast. Gold Coast rental stress is extremely high as well. And the rents down there continue to escalate, and the rent rises are very strong as well. So that's putting a lot of pressure on a lot of households. If we then look at the story of Perth, I'm afraid that rental stress is also on the rise in Perth as well. And whilst in and around the centre of Perth, it's not too bad. Once again, as you pull out, you can start to see some hot spots. Interestingly, the income growth in Western Australia has been quite a lot stronger. So to an extent, some people are finding things a little easier relative to the other states, but the yellows are quite significant. And remember that the population density also varies a little bit here as well. But you can see north and south of Perth on the coast, down towards Rockingham, pretty significant pressures. And the story goes on, really, if you actually look at, for example, financial stress. So that's the aggregate financial stress story. And financial stress, again, will start in the centre of Sydney at 2000 and drill out. And you can see here that there are significant areas where, again, remember I'm looking at all types of households now. You can see there that there are quite a few areas where we're in the yellows. And it's quite widely spread. So my point is, the assumption that there are just a few areas in difficulty is not actually lining with the data at all. Again, as you pull out, South Wentworthville, Liverpool, of course, stands out. And it's a bit the same across to the west, Campbelltown, places like that. Again, you can see the same problem. But my point is, financial stress lives in many different places across the Sydney Basin. If I then look at the story in Melbourne, and because of the postcode pressures in 3000, of course, it's there for financial stress overall. And if you pull out, again, you see that there are many postcodes where there is quite a degree of financial pressure and pain. Wyndham, of course, stands out. A few where it's not so bad, the blues. But I do find this postcode 3029, 3030 is a very interesting area to look at. A lot of new migrants, of course, in there as well. And if we go down to Greater Dandenong and Casey and Cardinia, you can see there that there are significant pressures there too. So that's the story with regards to overall financial stress. And in fact, if you pull out a bit further, and just look more broadly, even Ballarat and other regional centres are also experiencing financial stress as well. So wherever you look, there's a story to be told here. And if we go across to Brisbane, similar story. We're in the yellows. Financial stress is haunting quite a few areas. Fortitude Valley in particular, I noticed, is definitely up there. And as we pull out, as you perhaps would expect, we start to see similar patterns where Ipswich is featured, 4305, places like that, 4300, and down on the Gold Coast. So financial pressures on the Gold Coast are continuing to build, and I see that in all of my data at the moment. And that's a bit counter to what some people are claiming with regards to the property price uplifts that we're seeing there. It's not as uniform as some people are suggesting. And quickly, if we look at Perth, you can see here that we do have similar stories around the centre of the city. Maybe not too bad. Wembley's not looking too bad. But when you go to the north and the south, you start to see these yellows coming in. And South Perth in particular, if you look there, north, you see it, Wanneroo still stands out, and further down as well, down towards Rockingham. So net, when you look at the mapping here, what you can see is this gradation. There are some areas where it's not too bad. There are other areas where it's pretty significant. And these long-term pressures on households are having significant financial pressures initially. And I'm talking to a debt counsellor the other day who's never been busier with a number of people struggling to try and balance the various demands on their households. And particularly, of course, with the cost of living relating to rental or mortgages, but also other things too. And we are seeing a lot of people choosing not to get dental treatment, for example, not eating well, eating cheaper foods to try and get by. And of course, there's a consequence as well for the families. But it also leads on to social pressures. And I look at some of the crime rates in some of the high stressed areas, and it's continuing to rise in some areas, according to the latest statistics. And so there are social consequences coming through as well. And again, I don't believe that some of the politicians are really recognizing the pressures that are building, both socially as well as economically, in those areas. So that's sort of the sort of the first part of the story when it comes to the mapping. And, the consequences are quite serious because even with the expectation of lower rate cuts ahead, maybe a lot of people are going to be still struggling. And yet they're struggling into an environment where people are trying to talk house prices up. They're saying, you should buy now because, things will perhaps be more expensive later. And in my earlier shows, I highlighted the fact that quite often people are buying from emotion without necessarily doing the work on the economics. So that's a story with regard to the analysis that I wanted to share. Now, what we can also do is look in a little bit more detail at specific postcodes. And as you know, I have the ability to be able to show particular postcodes. And this is, of course, the model that I use. I always start with postcode 2500. It's traditional, of course, because it's a postcode I know very well, Wollongong. And it's a bit of an archetypal postcode insofar that it tells us quite a lot about what's going on. And what you can see here, if you sort of follow this, is you can see here we've got 19,200 households or thereabout in this postcode at the moment. That's households, not individuals. We've got 28% owning outright. We've got 23% borrowing. We've got 48% renting. So a lot of renters in the area. Mortgage stress is 1/3. So that's more than 1,500 households in mortgage stress in this postcode. But rental stress at 72%, more than 6,700 households struggling. We've got some stressed investors. About 1/3 of those with investment properties are seeing difficulty because of the pressures on rental payments. And overall financial stress at 52% is quite high. That has an influence on the trajectory of price scenarios, as we'll come on to in a second. Now, in terms of property mix, 35% are houses, but more and more are units as they continue to build more high-rise in and around Wollongong. It's a disaster what's happening there with regards to the latest developments. A lot of them are built very cheaply and are still very expensive. You can see also that the people ratio is on 2, so that's not just individuals, but some couples and maybe some families too. The vacancy rate was quite high when this was done, but this vacancy rate was done when the census was done, and that, of course, was at the end of COVID, so it was a bit perhaps unusual. I think the vacancy rate is probably a bit lower at the moment. Gross investment yield is quite interesting. That's the relationship between the price and the theoretical rental yield at 3.4%. That's sort of middle of the road. Everybody quotes gross investment yields, of course, in the property sector, but of course it's not true as to what that really means in practice. I look at net investment yield, which is the combination of money in and money out. In other words, what do I have to pay for the mortgage? What do I have to pay for managing the property? What do I have to pay for repairing it? And what income am I actually getting? That includes, of course, whether the property is let or not. And in this postcode, whilst the gross investment yield is 3.4, the net investment yield is underwater. It's minus 1%. So property investors are losing money. And in fact, there are a lot of property investors across the country, particularly in Melbourne and also in areas of Sydney, losing quite a lot of money on a cash flow basis, which is one reason why property investors are selling. If we look at the taxable income data from the ATO, this is the year 21-22, that's the latest available. $71,000 is the average. The household census was 84,000. And where there's a difference, in other words, where the household census is suggesting that more than one income is potentially supporting the household, it comes up with a multi-flag. And that means that there are multiple incomes paying the mortgage. And that all translates to a disposable monthly income of around $5,900. And currently, 41.7% of that disposable income, or $2,467 a month, is going on the typical mortgage, and 33.7%, or $1,993, going on the typical rent. And that is high. Remember, of course, in the old days, people would say, oh, it's more than 30%, you've got a problem. Well, disposable monthly income at 33 and 41, that is a big problem. That, of course, puts a lot of pressure on households. Now, in terms of the price trajectory, the modelling also suggests that in the best case scenario, there is still a chance of prices moving up. And the best case scenario is, of course, that more rates come, which is what the RBA is suggesting. The base case is that maybe those rate cuts aren't going to come. And so we sort of drift along where we are and inflation rises a bit. The worst case is inflation is stronger, rates have to be increased, and we have a significant slowdown, maybe even a recession in Australia. So those are the three scenarios I use. And you can see here that in the best case scenario over 3 years, there are still potential for prices to rise, 9% over 3 years. The base case is going sideways or a bit of a fall over 3 years. And the worst case is a significant fall. So all of those there. And units tend to follow on, maybe a little less dynamically so, but that tells you quite a lot about what is actually happening in reality. So let me now go back and let's have a little look at the requests for other data points and see what we've got. I saw a few requests coming in. It's going back to the top of the chat. Just bear with me a moment. Okay, so we had Daniel asked for postcode 4163. Well, let's put that one in. So this is Cleveland in Queensland, in Brisbane and Moreton. And I'm going to take you off now, Daniel, so you can see the full report. So there is 7,100 households there, 39.9, 40% own outright, a third of 30% are borrowing, and a third, or 30% are renting. Mortgage stress at 43.7%, rental stress at 89.7%, some investor stress, overall financial stress at 45%. 60% are houses, 19% are units, 20% are other types of property. That could be a standalone, that could be sitting over retail, other things like that. People ratio is 2.11, so that suggests some families as well as individuals. The vacancy rate was 6.7% when the census was done. Gross investment yield is 4.3. It tends to be higher in and around Queensland. Net investment yield, though, is still negative, minus 0.2. Average taxable, 87,000. Household census, 74,000. and that gives a disposal monthly of around $5,100, with 46% going on the typical mortgage, $2,400, and 38.5%, 1993, going on the typical rent. In terms of scenarios, the best case scenario, a 10% rise over the next 3 years in prices. The base case, a small fall. The worst case, a more significant fall, and units beginning to follow on. Let's look at another one. Postcode 2200. So this is Bankstown in Sydney. And there we have 15,656 households, with 25% owning outright, 28% are borrowing, and 46% are renting. 29% are actually in mortgage stress, 86% are in rental stress. We have a third of stressed investors as well, and we have 56% of households in financial stress in that particular area. We have 38% of houses, 44% units, and 16% other types of property. The people ratio is very high, so this is families. We have a vacancy rate that's also quite high. The gross investment yield was 3.3%. Again, a negative net investment yield, minus 0.6%. Looking at the taxable income, the ATO said the average taxable was $52,900. The household census says 72,000, so the multi-flag comes up. Multiple incomes are going on these particular households, and the disposal monthly is just over 5,000, with 46.6% going on the typical mortgage, $2,368 a month, and 40% going on the typical rent at $2,044 a month, which is painfully high. On the scenario basis, best case, up 7.8% over 3 years. The base case, a fall of 7% over 3 years. This is a cumulative measure, of course. And the worst case, a fall of 26% over the next 3 years if everything goes really pear-shaped. So there we go. Let's go on to the next one. Done that one. Looking down the list and see what else we've got. What else? Lots of questions, lots of comments. Okay, where else? Just bear with me as I go down the list. Australia is like a pressure cooker. Yep, I agree with that. It is. Okay, Bossman asks 44510. Caboolture. Take that offline again. I'll remember the 4615 in a second. This is another Brisbane and Moreton suburb. More than 21,000 households there, 26% owning outright, 36% of borrowing, and 37% of renting. The stress level is at 21%, so it's there but not massive, but rental stress is very high, 82%, and stressed investors at 22%, financial stress at 43%. Mostly houses, 83%, small number of units, other types of property. People ratio is quite high, so again, families. Vacancy rate, 6.9%. Gross investment yield is 4.4%. Net investment yield is 0 in this particular one. By the way, I should say I recalculate this each month, so it might vary month on month. Taxable income, 55,000, compared with the census at 68,000. The multi-flag comes up, giving a disposal monthly around $4,500, with 41.6% going on the typical mortgage at $1,906 a month, and 35.3%, or 1,619, going on the typical rent. And looking at scenarios, well, the best case is a rise of 14% over 3 years. The base case, flat. The worst case, a fall of 21% over 3 years, and units following on. And you also asked for 4615. Nanango. Smaller postcode, so just be a little bit cautious on the calculations here. Just going to shift in my chair, sorry about the noise. 3,000 households, 48% owning outright, 29% are actually borrowing, and 22% are renting. A third in mortgage stress, 25% in rental stress. Financial stress much lower here at 15%. 92% houses, small number of units, other types of property, and the vacancy rate's quite high. Maybe that's Airbnb, second homes, and those sorts of things. Gross investment yield is 4.5. Net investment yield is positive, just 0.1%. The average taxable is 52,000 versus 47,000 from the census, and that gives a disposal monthly just over 3,300 with 36.3%, 1,200 going on the typical mortgage, and 34%, 1,121 going on the typical rent. And the scenarios are pretty positive, 22% over 3 years. Best case, base case up 7%. The worst case down 12% over 3 years in units following on. So ask for Happy Valley. Yes, is it happy? We will see. 3360. Low count. And it's in the Otway Ranges. I wonder whether that is the right postcode. I can't cross-check it backwards, so you have to tell me whether I've got the right one. But 3360 is what you asked for. Very low count, so I need to be cautious on the data here. The stress levels are quite high. The investors are also feeling it as well. But you can see here a lot of people own outright. There's some borrowing, 37%, and some renting as well. Financial stress at 59%. Mostly houses. And very high vacancy rates. Again, second homes, Airbnb, and all that stuff. Gross investment yield is 2.6. Net investment yield is negative. And the typical taxable 59 versus 61,000, giving a disposal monthly just over 4,000, with a third going on the mortgage, 1,352, and a third going on the typical rent, 1,395. And looking at the scenarios, because of the financial stress metric, the growth in terms of appreciation, even in the best case scenario, is pretty limited, and of course falls on the other scenarios. Going down the list, yet another comment. Interesting. I'll do that one first. I missed one further up. I'll go back to that 6053. This is Bayswater in Western Australia in the Stirling district. And it is 6,600 households, 27% owning outright, 44% borrowing, so the mortgage belt, 27% are renting, 36%, more than 1,000 in mortgage stress, 70% in rental stress, some investor stress, and overall financial stress at 43%. 80% of houses, some units, and other types of property. People ratio is just over 2, and the vacancy rate was 9. Gross investment yield 4.3. Next investment yield is minus 0.1%. Average taxable 82 versus 105,000 from the census, giving a multi-flag and an income of around $6,400 a month. With, this is disposal monthly, of course. That's after tax. 36.9%, $2,400 going on the mortgage, and 26.8%, $1,745 going on the typical rent. From a price scenario, 40% rise over 3 years. Best case scenario, flat. Base case, fall of 20% over 3 years. Darryl asked for 6230. Okay, 6230 is Carey Park in Stirling, so a similar sort of area. Make sure I take you off. And 18,700 households, 29% owning outright, 38% borrowing, which is more than 7,000. So again, mortgage belt land, and 32% are renting, more than 6,000. High levels of mortgage stress, 73% mortgage stress, 65% rental stress, some investor stress, overall financial stress, 51%. That's more than 9,000 households in the area. 80% are houses, some units and other types of property there too. Vacancy rate was a bit higher, 10%. Gross investment yield 3.8, net investment yield minus 0.7, and the taxable on average 72 versus 76, giving a disposal monthly of 5,500 with 32%, 1,820 going on the typical mortgage, 26.8, 1,495 going on the typical rent, And the scenarios are best case, a rise of 11% over 3 years, base case, a fall of 4% over 3 years, and the worst case, a fall of 23% over 3 years. Okay. Jelly Melly wanted Lismore 2480. Now, of course, Lismore might be impacted by floods and things, so always interesting to figure that out. We do have 19,000 there. We do have 38% earning outright, 30% with a borrowing mortgage, and 27% are renting. Don't have mortgage stress detected in there at the moment. That, of course, is possibly because in some cases, some of those may have payments suspended currently because of the flooding. We'll see. Renters are feeling it though, and overall financial stress 32%. 84% of houses, some units and types of property. The vacancy rate at 7.2%, gross investment yield is 3.4, net investment yield is minus 0.7. So again, some of those investors underwater. The taxable is around 60,000 or 68,000 from the census giving a multi-flag, and that gives us a disposal monthly of 4715 with 38.6%, 1820 going on the typical mortgage and 32.8%, 1544 going on the typical rent. And scenarios, well, there is a rise of 11% over 3 years, best case, base case a slight fall, just over 3%, and the worst case down 23%. Who named it Happy Valley? AI said, a good question, yes. And yeah, another comment said, thanks. You're very welcome. Glad to be able to help. I think that's pretty much up to date with the postcodes. So let's see whether any more come in. The next thing I wanted to do was just to delve slightly further into this issue of the gross and net investment yields. And particularly, I wanted to show you the net investment yield mapping, because net investment yield mapping is really very interesting. Remember I said that net investment yield was the true return in a cash flow basis. So I'm ignoring the equity that might be being created as prices rise or fall. I'm looking at the cash flow. But if you're an investor, it's very important to do a cash flow calculation. And am I actually covering my costs, or am I totally relying on the prospect of the capital gain later? And of course, the answer is, well, I can make a loss and I can write the loss off, which of course is part of the tax break story. But I think it's really important to understand. And when I talk to people with investment properties, it amazes me how few actually do the analysis to be able to look at what the real returns are on a cash flow basis. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm going to start in Sydney, and this is the way the maps look. So the most red, the net investment yield is minus 1.5% or more, and we go to the slightly paler red and down through the pinks, and all of those are showing different loss levels. And then we go into the bluey, and the dark blue are the positives. So in this particular area, the point I want to make is that from an investment perspective, there are many areas where property investors are deeply underwater from a cash flow perspective. Even places like Vaucluse, not doing too bad, but North Bondi, for example, Darlinghurst, Balmain, North Sydney, Burwood, Marrickville, Waterloo, they're all showing negativity. I think this is really important for people to understand. Now, there are areas like Croydon Park, Strathfield, doing quite a lot better, Bellevue Hill, Lane Cove. But there are significant hotspots in the city area and around the harbour. And it's replicated when you go towards Fairfield in the west, though there are some doing better. Hornsby's not so bad. 2175, not too bad. But if you look down Camden Way or Campbelltown or Penrith, places like that, Hawkesbury, you see there's a lot of red there, a lot of places where people are losing money from a cash flow perspective on their investment property. Now, you might choose to wear the loss on the assumption you're going to get capital gains, but I'm a little bit more skeptical than some about the capital gains story, as you will know. Now, if we go to Melbourne, Central Melbourne, the returns are a little bit more positive in 3003. But when you start pulling out, you can see again the same story. There are areas where, once again, Moonee Valley, Hawthorne, a few other areas too, towards Brimbank, Altona, Glen Iris. And in fact, as you pull out, you can see here, particularly around Wyndham, 3029 and 3024, where we have a lot of issues. And of course, over to the east as well, Knox, for example, and beyond Monash, beyond the Dandenongs, and then down towards Casey. So the story in Melbourne is not good when it comes to the rental returns. In fact, Melbourne and the surrounding area are by far the worst rental returns from a net investment perspective. Now, I know that's not the only way of looking at it, but it's the way that I think is the best way to look at it. Now, we compare that with Brisbane, for example. In Brisbane, the story is quite different. So remember that the blues are positive returns. And you can see there are still some areas like Windsor and places like that. 4151. 4174 is much more positive, and Rockley as well, 4106. So you can see that the story of investing in and around Brisbane is quite different. And that's one of the reasons why I've always said investing in Brisbane investment property has been, up until now, better from a cash flow perspective than investing in either Sydney or Melbourne, which is why quite a few people are actually buying property in and around the Brisbane area, putting more upward pressure on prices in and around Brisbane. Gold Coast, slightly negative as well, you can see there as we look out. But there are other areas, as you pull out further, that again show, Southern Downs, for example, 4362, 4309, and 4514. So that's that one. Let's just continue the story and look at Adelaide, because you think Adelaide, what's happening with Adelaide? Well, Adelaide is now becoming more and more difficult from an investment perspective. A lot of people have been buying into Adelaide in recent times because of the better returns and lower prices, except the prices have started to rise quite substantially. And the cost of the mortgage, of course, is still quite high. And the capacity for renters to pay is limited because the incomes have not grown as fast. So you can see here as we pull out from Adelaide, how from Northwood, round to Collinswood, round to Kilburn, Mansfield Park, and Alberton, a lot of questions about returns. And the story goes on as you pull out. There are areas like Clovelly Park where it's a little easier, and there are some blue patches. But the warning here is that there are considerable areas in and around Adelaide where property investors are now starting to lose their shirt. And that'll be an interesting development. If it happens, it means that the demand for investment property in this area might be starting to ease. But we'll see about that. It's too soon to say. If I look at Perth, you can see here the blues in some areas like West Leederville. Well, that's a more affluent area, so perhaps you'd expect it. In South Perth, it's not too bad either, and Redford. But if you go out to Wembley Downs, for example, or Seabra, or even places like Subiaco, or south to St James, further south, places like Melville, you can see that there are some significant issues. It varies, of course, not uniformly. But my warning here is there are areas where property investors, they're buying into Perth in big numbers, are still not making a cash flow return. Now, you can put your bet on the future capital appreciation, I guess, but I must tell you that I think that's a problem when it comes to looking at some of these things. So to my mind, this is a very important warning of what is going on. And talking about warnings and what's going on, the other thing I wanted to just talk briefly about was default risk. Now, this is, of course, relating to mortgages. Default risk is quite interesting. This is my modeling, looking at the next year and thinking about what may be happening. Now, defaults, if rates come down, may ease off. But it is quite interesting to say, well, where are the default risks? This is the count of default risks of households. And you can see that close into the centre of Sydney, the default risks are relatively low. But as we pull out places like Mosman, Randwick, and Waterloo, Strathfield, we start to see a little bit of a rise. Cumberland as well. Some of the northern beaches, Lane Cove, North Ryde, the Hills, Blacktown. And my real observation here, when you look at this data, is that it is quite spread. So risk of default is not just located in those hotspots, those mortgage hotspots that we looked at, Blacktown, Liverpool, Campbelltown. Mortgage default risk is more broadly spread. And that's because, of course, a lot of people are quite leveraged up. They've got other cash flow pressures as well. And it goes back to what I said at the top of the show. A lot of council rates have risen, of course, recently as well. Costs of energy have risen. And if fuel prices rise too, cookie, great minds think alike. Well done. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'd also make the point that, of course, a lot of people, when they live further out, are still having to pay toll fees. And that's another big impost on people too. If I then do a similar exercise looking at Melbourne, again, I'm looking at default risk. So in and around the centre of Melbourne, there's a bit of default risk. Go into the outer band like North Melbourne and West Melbourne, it's not so high. And in fact, if we come out further, some of the areas around Wyndham, not too bad. But when you go out further than that, 3029, 3030, same old. Default rates are much higher. And you can see there's some real hotspots there. Also, 3064 to the north as well. And down towards Frankston, there's a real hotspot there of default risk. And even out towards Ballarat, some degree of risk. But the point I want to make is that, again, it's a patchwork quilt. Now, it's not just a simple correlation between that and mortgage stress. It's a much more complex set of relationships because different people are leveraged up in different ways to different degrees. But it is important to understand. And we're talking here a substantial enough numbers of people likely to default to potentially depress house prices in some of these postcodes. If we go to Brisbane, default risk in and around Brisbane is somewhat lower, but it does exist. South Brisbane, for example, a little bit stronger relative to some of the other areas. And again, I've been watching this build. The default risk is definitely getting more of a concern in and around Brisbane than previously, partly because people are more leveraged, partly because they got bigger mortgages. And the result of that, default risk is there. But look at the Gold Coast. The Gold Coast stands out to me as an area to watch. I'm seeing lots of pressure, a lot of default risk, a lot of people leveraged to the gills. And interestingly, some of the property prices in this area are sliding now. And I think it's directly related to the risk of default. Now, risk of default doesn't mean people aren't going to default. Doesn't mean they're going to put their property on the market, but it shows you that they're near the edge. And so this is my leading indicator of where I think trouble will be. If I then go to Perth, just look at Western Australia, default risk is also present in some areas, not dramatically so, but enough to be a little cautious in some areas. And in fact, as we pull out, we can see that it's a bit of a similar story to some other areas. One area, of course, stands out. Yeah, you'd sort of expect that, wouldn't you? In 6164, 6112, higher risk of default there as well. That's consistent with our other modelling that we saw. So you can see that there are areas where the default risk is quite a bit higher. And hopefully, most people, if they do default, because of the price rises, will be able to sell and get out and get some equity. Whereas in the other, Melbourne, for example, there's chances that they won't because price rises have been less momentum. So that's the final bit of the puzzle. So what do I make of all this when I sort of put it all together? 3 points. The first is people are still significantly under pressure when it comes to what's going on with their mortgages and with their rents. And the story that somehow magically everything is now fixed, you know, the government's paid us to, pay our electricity bills and things. So it's all fixed. No, it's not fixed. This is a significant and continuing crisis. Crisis for those in the mortgage sector, crisis for those in the rental sector. The second point to make is that whilst interest rates may come down, and I'm still a little more skeptical about how far they will come, the other pressures on households, and I showed you those slides earlier on from, interest rates, yes. Electricity costs, yes. Insurance costs, yes. The council rates, yes. Wherever you look. And I don't believe that the true inflation rate for many people is anything like the official number. As we've discussed previously, for all sorts of reasons, that number is a bit flawed. But actually more than just a bit flawed. So there's a real pressure there, and this pressure is going to continue. That's going to put a lot of difficulty on people. The third point, though, is that a lot of people are thinking about whether now is the time to buy. So, I'm a first-time buyer. I'm going to perhaps move when the government supports me, so I need a small deposit. Just worth highlighting again, as I said in that earlier point, you have to think about your cash flow projections as well, because it isn't just about, can I get the deposit? If you actually have a bigger mortgage, you're still going to have to pay more, and that interest payment is going to continue month in, month out. If you have a property, you've got to pay maintenance. If you've got a property, you also have to pay, of course, things like the insurance and also the other things like water and gas, if you have gas, all those things. So it's a continuing pressure of maintaining a property. And I sometimes think that people are fooling themselves. And I'll give you one specific example, and that is where you actually are thinking of buying a unit in a high rise and you look at the strata fees. And people don't often factor in continuing strata fees, but also importantly, the continuing lift in strata fees, because strata fees tend to go up significantly faster than the typical rent itself. And strata fees are a significant factor for many people if you're owning a property. And strata fees also feed in potentially to the rents if you're an investor and you're trying to actually cover the costs, because strata fees are so high. And a lot of properties, of course, need a lot of maintenance. So to my mind, this is really, really important. Now, I see a few questions being asked with regard to postcodes. Vanessa says, hi, Vanessa, how are you going? Nice to see you. Postcode 3336. Yep, let me do that. Just set myself up to do it. Push a few buttons. Three, 3336. Bring it back online. There we go. 3336 is Melton. And here we have 5,500 households, 24% owning outright. A lot of people borrowing, not much in the way of renting at the time. 49% in mortgage stress, more than 2,000, and financial stress 37%. 96% of houses, small number of units. People ratio is very high, so a lot of families in this area. Vacancy rate's extremely low. Gross investment yield is 3.3, but the net investment yield minus 1.9%. Taxable income from the ATO on the individual is 67,000, but the household census says 119,000, so multiple incomes going on the mortgage. Multi-flag comes up. And then looking at the disposable income, $8,300, quite high. 31% going on the mortgage, $2,580, and 25%, just over $2,000 going on the typical rent. Scenarios. Best case scenario, 11% over 3 years. Base case, a small fall. And the worst case, a fall of 23%. So there you go. Gerard asked for 4060. This is Ashgrove, again, in the Brisbane and Moreton area. 5,000 households, 30% owning outright, 42% borrowing, 26% are renting, 18.5% in mortgage stress, 69% in rental stress, overall financial stress, 35%. And looking at the property mix, 77% of houses, 20% of units, small number of types of property, Vacancy rates 5.8%, gross investment yields 4.5%, net investment yield just negative, minus 0.3%. Average taxable 114,000, that's one of the highest we've seen. Average from the census, this is the household, 149,000, giving a disposal monthly of more than $9,000 a month, with 34% going on the mortgage, more than $3,100, and 24% more than $2,100 going on the typical rent. And looking at scenarios, best case 15% over 3 years, base case flat, worst case a fall of 19% in units following on. Okay, see whether there are any others I missed. Tassie asked for 7011. Nice to see Tasmania on the list. Okay, 7011. So this is Berrydale in South Tasmania, including Austin's Ferry, 6,700, 28% owning outright, 37% borrowing, 33% are renting, 70% in mortgage stress, 88% in rental stress, 27% in investor stress, and 63% in financial stress overall. 79% of houses, 16% of units, no types of property, and the vacancy rate was over 5. Gross investment yield 4.9%, net investment yield positive 0.2%. Average taxable 56,000 for the individual, 67,000 for the household census, giving a multi. Their flag coming up with disposal monthly around $4,800 a month, 32.3% going on the typical mortgage 1560, and 33% going on the typical rent at 1595. From a scenario basis, I'm afraid that I don't have good news for you. Even in the best case scenario, I'm seeing small falls over the next 3 years and more significant falls in the base and worst case scenarios for this particular area. There are some particular issues with Tasmania, with limited incomes, significant price growth previously, and of course, a bit of a difficult situation with what's going on at the moment. And Vanessa, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciate. Thank you very much for that. Dylan asked for postcode 4670. This is in Wide Bay, of course. And here we have 35,000 households with 39% earning outright, 30% borrowing, 30% are renting. We have 30% in mortgage stress, more than 3,200 households, 87% in rental stress, more than 9,300. Some investor stress too, and overall financial stress at 42%, more than 14,900 households. Mostly houses, 83%, some units and types of property. People ratio is just above 2, and the vacancy rate's 8.4%. Could be some second homes, Airbnb, and that sort of stuff there, I suspect. Gross investment yield is 4.5. Net investment yield is minus 0.3%. Looking at the taxable data from the ATO, 60,000 from the individual, according to the ATO, and 62,000 from the census, giving a disposal monthly of 4,358, with 35.8% going on the mortgage, 1560, and 32.6%, 1420, going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, best case scenario, 11% over 3 years, base case, a small fall, and the worst case, a fall of 23% over 3 years, units following on. Right, have I picked up all of the requests? Let's have a look. Rottnest Island, 6162. I have no idea what that would... I'll try. I don't know. Let's have a look. This is a very artificial one, isn't it? Yeah. No. Sorry, can't do Rottnest Island. I tried. Not surprisingly, given its weird nature. All right. Well, William asked for Wollongong. I did Wollongong. Look back in the stream. That was the first one I did, so I've already done that one. I'm not going to do it again. But thank you for asking. And I think we're done. So, in conclusion, what can we say? what can we say indeed? Well, to my mind, I think 3 quick points. The first point, just I want to touch on scenarios in more detail. I told you about my scenarios and the fact that they're ways of exploring the future. Interestingly, the New Zealand Reserve Bank did some quite nice scenarios with a negative supply shock and a negative demand shock. It's interesting how they do it. If you want to see more of that, go and check out my report there. Kiwis get another rate cut, but will home prices respond? The answer is no, they're not. Home prices in New Zealand continue to fall. Post coming on that shortly. In terms of the scenarios, here are the 3, just to give you the slightly longer version than what I did before. So the Goldilocks zone, we see more rate cuts. Don't get a recession. Migration remains above average. The base case, soft landing. We see the rates hanging around. Cut a bit later. We don't get them up. We don't get a recession, but migration falls because migration is a big lever, of course. The nightmare is we see rates hanging around. We see unemployment rising. We see wages growth stalling, and we see migration dropping, and we actually end up with a trade-led recession. Of course, that was before the conflict in the Middle East came out. So that's the story on that one. And I really want to just underscore that these scenarios are not predictions. They're just showing you sensitivities. So, I could put a whole bunch of other sensitivities in. And if you've got another set of sensitivities you'd like me to run at some point, let me know. I'm happy to explore with that. But it is quite important. And Jason, thank you very much. Super chat. Really appreciate it. Really helps to cover the costs and things of doing this. I don't do profit. I do this because it's a really important conversation to have. So thank you very much for your continued support. Really do appreciate it. Vanessa asks, are Luna and Meter good dogs? Well, they actually make a lot of noise. But they make a lot of noise in any situation, whether it's a fox, whether it's a pigeon, or whether it's somebody coming down the road. So yeah, not reliable guard dogs, but they're pretty good. Friends, and of course they keep me fit. I walk my 10 miles a day plus, thanks to the 2 dogs. So I'm still doing my 25,000 steps or thereabout, which is part of my attempt to keep fit. Okay, so just to sort of round out the show, I'm just going to make a couple of closing comments, because I think it's important that if people are in financial difficulty, they've got some thoughts about what to do about it. Unfortunately, in my surveys, I quite often see people who actually say, oh, well, yeah, I know I've got a problem, but head in the sand time, hopefully it'll get fixed. Knowing what we know, I'm not convinced it will. So it's important to get help. Obviously, you can talk to your bank. They do have hardship schemes. They are obliged to try and help. But it is important to get the right information to be able to think about that. 2 sources. The first, of course, is the National Debt Helpline, 1-800-007-007. This is the government-backed one, government-funded one. And they are excellent at helping people tease out their financial pressures. They are very busy, of course. They keep saying they've never been busier. There are sources on the internet of quote help, unquote help, which don't do very reliable stuff and may well charge you for a deed of arrangement or other things. Get the advice from the right place, and I recommend National Debt Helpline. So that's the first point. The second point is it's really important to pull a cash flow together, pull your information together so you understand what there is. And this tool from AFCA is quite helpful. It gives you the ability to be able to statement to position information together, which helps you talking to your bank or talking to a debt counselor or whatever. And it lets you think about what you earn, what you owe, what your living expenses are, and what you owe. And from there, you can build a cash flow. And of course, if you build a cash flow, you can then prioritize, work out what's really important. And quite often what I see is that people are actually prioritizing the wrong things rather than actually prioritizing the really important things. And unfortunately, quite often people are not au fait enough with their cash flow to know where they're spending the money. Step 1, know where you're spending the money. Step 2 is prioritize effectively. So I recommend that tool. Also, if you are interested in supporting our work, we do run the Patreon program as well. Thank you for those who do support us via Patreon. I really appreciate it. And particularly, if you want to get the data that I've shared today for every postcode, you can do that. It's $50 a month plus GST. It's available. I'll be sending it out in the next day or so for this month, and we'll send it out to those who are subscribed at this tier every month around this time of the month once I've done my live show. And the story, of course, is that this gives you the ability to be able to manipulate the data and compare and contrast different postcodes. And frankly, it's a very powerful piece of information. Piece of information when you want to sort of figure out what's going on and making comparisons about rental investment properties, all those things. Cheers, Cookie. Thank you for your support and also for all the clips, as always, greatly appreciated. Jason, no worry about the name. I appreciate it nevertheless. Very important. Thank you for that as well. And I think we're done. So thank you very much for spending some time with me this evening. And I really appreciate all the help that I get. Dylan says, I do $5 a month. Thank you. Really appreciate it. I'll tell you, I really am reliant on a number of people who support through Patreon, through those various tiers. It really does help. It makes it possible for me to continue to run these shows. I don't do this for profit. I do this because I think there's a really important conversation to be had, and every contribution, whether it's via Patreon or whether it's via Super Chat, or indeed if you want to go and make a PayPal contribution, you can. And for those interested in the PayPal, you can actually make a one-off via PayPal as well. That's just a little bit of a plug there for that as well. Anyway, thank you very much for spending some time with them this evening. Hope you found it interesting and useful. Next week, I should say, we'll have a discussion about buyer's agents, and that should be great fun and very interesting. Veronica, of course, has some amazing insights into the way that the buyer's agent system works or doesn't work, and we'll be able to unpick that and perhaps talk about first-time buyers. And of course, you can ask her questions as well on other issues relating to property too. So mark your diary for that. The dog, well, I've got a dog. Luna is there. Meteor is under the desk. So I'm afraid you won't see her, but Luna's there. She's been there all the time. Not one bark, so that was very good. Anyway, thank you very much. Have a good evening. Keep safe. Take care. And I look forward to seeing you next week on the next live show. And of course, check out the recorded shows which come out every day of the week. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics, signing off. Take care.